Imagine trying to invent a totally new form of government from scratch, especially when your entire nation is literally demanding that you just copy the ruthless dictators next door. Well, that's exactly what happened in ancient Israel. Let's dive right into this fascinating explainer of Dr. Robert Vannoy's lecture. We're going to look at how Israel's transition to a monarchy wasn't just a simple change in leadership, it was actually the invention of a brilliant, completely unique constitutional government. We're looking at a pivotal moment in history that fundamentally changed the ancient world, and honestly set the stage for ideas about checks and balances that we still wrestle with today. Here is how we're going to break this all down. First, the paradox of kingship. Second, Saul's three-stage rise. Then, the Gilgal assembly, followed by the covenant conditional. And finally, the monarchy's lasting legacy. Okay, Section 1, the paradox of kingship. Was this treason against God or part of a divine plan? To understand this massive paradigm shift, we really have to grapple with a huge paradox. You see, the Israelites demanding a human king was essentially treason against God. It was a direct rejection of his rule over them. They wanted a visible, powerful warlord they could actually see and touch, rather than an invisible God. They demanded an absolute, autonomous ruler, somebody who would operate exactly like the ruthless monarchs of the surrounding pagan nations. But, surprise, God told the prophet Samuel to go ahead and grant their request anyway. And here is where Samuel pulls off a brilliant constitutional maneuver. He gave them a king, sure, but he instituted an entirely different framework. He made absolutely certain the new monarch would be strictly subordinate to the prophets and completely bound by the existing laws of the Sinai covenant. So, Samuel essentially invented what we call a covenantal kingship. This is a completely unique governmental structure where the human king doesn't actually possess autonomous authority. He wasn't a lawmaker or a law unto himself like the pharaohs or the Mesopotamian kings. Nope. Instead, he was merely an instrument, kind of like a subordinate middle management administrator for the Lord's supreme rule over the nation. The monarchy didn't replace the existing theocracy, it was carefully, deliberately plugged right into it. Think of it this way. The king was just a tenant. He was definitely not the landlord. Moving on to Section 2, Saul's three-stage rise, from the fields to the throne. Notice the careful psychology of this transition. Saul didn't just wake up one morning, slap on a crown, and start issuing decrees. It happened in a very specific, highly orchestrated three-stage sequence. Phase 1 was his designation at Mizpah, where he was publicly chosen by lot. But even after that, Saul didn't take over. He literally just went back home to work his fields. Then comes Phase 2, the confirmation. When the Ammonites threatened the city of Jabesh-Gilead, God's Spirit empowered Saul to rally the troops and secure a massive military victory. This proved his capability to a pretty skeptical public. And finally, we reach Phase 3, the inauguration at Gilgal, which served as the official coronation and covenant renewal. This was no accident. It safely transitioned a private citizen working a plow into a battle-tested commander. Section 3, the Gilgal Assembly, a courtroom climax. Now that final stage at Gilgal is where the real drama unfolds. It acts much less like a joyous royal party and much, much more like a high-stakes legal courtroom proceeding. Samuel summons the people with a highly specific, kind of curious phrase, "Let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom." Now this specific wording has puzzled scholars and translators for years, mostly because it implies something that just doesn't quite add up. Think about it. How could they renew Saul's kingdom if he hadn't even started ruling yet? It sounds like a logical trap. And, well, it is, because Samuel wasn't talking about renewing Saul's kingdom at all. He was demanding they renew Yahweh's kingdom. The central issue here was that by asking for a human king in the first place, the people had broken their covenant with God. Before Saul could properly take the throne and actually lead the nation, that broken legal relationship absolutely had to be restored. At Gilgal, Samuel essentially steps into the role of a prosecuting attorney, and he presents an absolute masterclass in historical evidence. On one side, he lists Yahweh's flawless track record, the righteous acts of delivering Israel from Egypt, providing constant security through Moses and Aaron, and granting military victories. He uses that perfect historical resume as a glaring contrast against the people's rap sheet on the other side, their repeated apostasies, turning to idolatry, and the ultimate treason of demanding a human king just because they didn't trust God to protect them. Samuel is legally, systematically demonstrating their guilt right before the court of heaven. But before handing over the reins, Samuel does something modern politicians rarely do. He actually demands a public audit of his own integrity. The gathered crowd publicly testifies that Samuel never took from them, never defrauded anyone, never oppressed anyone, and never accepted bribes. Now, why does this matter? He's definitely not just bragging here. Samuel is deliberately setting a rock-solid legal precedent. By proving he never abused his power as a leader, he creates a strict, unbending standard of integrity that the new king, Saul, is now legally trapped into emulating. Okay, Section 4, the covenant conditional, grammar as the ultimate contract. With the covenant successfully renewed, Samuel establishes what is called the manner of the kingdom, which is basically Israel's new constitution, and he bases it on a very specific set of conditions. The king and the people are given 4 strict rules: fear the Lord, serve him faithfully, listen to his voice, and do not rebel against his commands. Now, in the ancient Near East, kings made the rules, but in Israel, the king was entirely subject to them. Samuel is heavily emphasizing that the supreme obligation of the children of Israel hasn't changed one single bit, even with a shiny new human king sitting on the throne. And here is where grammar actually becomes a binding contract. Some English translations water down 1 Samuel 12:14, adding the phrase, "it will be well," just to make the sentence flow a bit better in English. But the original, accurate Hebrew text is a strict, almost mathematical if-then equation. If you fear the Lord, then you will follow Yahweh. In ancient Hebrew culture, to follow after someone meant literally recognizing them as your sovereign. So their physical obedience to those 4 steps wasn't just a polite suggestion, it was the literal, tangible proof that both the king and the people were continuing to recognize Yahweh as their true ultimate king. It was the perfect way to prevent divided loyalties. Section 5. The monarchy's lasting legacy, from Saul to the messianic expectation. To seal this totally unprecedented constitutional monarchy, Samuel calls down a miraculous sign of thunder and rain right in the absolute middle of the dry wheat harvest. It was a terrifying display of divine endorsement that proved God's power over the new government. But as we know, human nature is fragile, and over the next centuries, the system was severely put to the test. In the 11th century BC, Saul tragically failed to live up to this covenantal ideal. In the 10th century, David took the throne and received the promise of an eternal dynasty. For hundreds of years following that, prophets continuously acted as constitutional watchdogs, holding corrupt kings accountable to the exact standards Samuel set at Gilgal. Because human king after human king just kept failing, it built a fever-pitch prophetic expectation for a perfect, divine human king. An expectation that is, of course, ultimately fulfilled in the 1st century AD with the arrival of Jesus as the ultimate messianic king. Samuel left the ancient Israelites with a really stark warning. Putting your ultimate trust in human leadership, or really anything other than God, is essentially trusting in nothingness. It literally cannot save you. And that leaves us with a profound question as we wrap up this explainer today. If true security never comes from a human ruler, what modern kings, whether that be politicians, careers, or wealth, are you choosing to follow after and place your absolute trust in?